All right. So pretty simple agenda tonight. We've got, we'll quickly go through what's the buzz. If anybody's got any comments they want to throw out there tonight, just in general terms about the process that we're doing. We've got Sharon Haig here from SiteLogic, with a nice blue background there. And she's going to go through some facility assessments with us. And then we're going to talk for a couple minutes afterwards about our upcoming meeting schedule. And I appreciate all of you who replied to the survey with some of those questions there. And we'll talk just a little bit about that at the end of the meeting and what you can expect coming up, or hopefully what you can expect anyway, depending on what happens here. So anybody have comments, have any conversation with other folks about what we're doing, just general remarks, feel free to pop open your mic or drop something in the chat box.
Just in case you didn't see the school board meeting, I want you all to know that I read your names at the school board meeting and said, we really want some input. So here are some folks who would be able to talk to you. So I hope your phones don't start blowing up, but I hope you do start getting some calls or questions.
Yeah. And coming up, when we talk about the schedule, I think we're going to have a little bit of an opportunity to give you some time at least to outreach to some folks as well. So, but we will continue on because, you know, I'm really excited to, well, first, we'll skip the meeting norms tonight. I think we all understand them. Again, make sure that you give everybody an opportunity to talk. I don't think that's been a problem so far, but here's where I wanted to go. So anyway, we've got Sharon Haig here tonight. Sharon's a development engineer. She's actually our development engineering leader at SiteLogic. She's a mechanical engineer. She's got a lot of other letters in her title that you can see there. I'm not sure what they even all mean, to be honest. She's an impressive engineer. She's been working with the West Delaware School District for a while now on a lot of these facility assessment pieces. And she's a mom of a couple of kids who are in school too. So, you know, she comes at this from a variety of perspectives and is very passionate about this stuff. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Sharon, to go through the assessment presentation. And just for task force members, tonight, the output, the conversation we're going to have will be a little bit different. We're not likely going to go into small group tonight, but Sharon's got built in through her presentation a number of points where we can ask questions and we can have some conversation about the subjects that she's talking about. So please feel free to use those points in the presentation to not only ask questions, but maybe provide some comments as well that are coming to mind as we go through that presentation, so that your task force members also have an idea of where you're at. Okay. So I will stop sharing my screen, Sharon, and you can go ahead and take over.
All right, let me get this started. Okay. All right. Trying to set it up so I can see people on Zoom and look at the presentation at the same time. So, all right. Can everyone see it okay? Yeah, all right. As Tom mentioned, I've got spots in here kind of between categories to go ahead and ask questions, but feel free if you have a question. I'm not afraid to make this interactive. It's actually more fun that way. So please don't be afraid to speak up as I'm working through this. So Tom kind of introduced me. I am an engineer that worked on this project doing the assessment data with the district. So we went through and looked at the building both from our professional lens, but also grabbing input from both your teaching staff, your administrative staff, and your building maintenance staff. So when we start looking at a building, we break it down into 16 categories. We like to say everything from the blacktop to the rooftop gets looked at, and we take all of this data and we put it into what we call an asset condition assessment. And I'll get into what that looks like in just a minute. The first thing we look at is when the building was built, so we can get an idea of what how old that infrastructure is and when it originated from. Looking at your high school, and this is probably not news to most of you, you have some additions put on in 2006 and 2008. They're beautiful additions with the older sections dating all the way back to 1951. There haven't been a lot of updates to those older sections. You can see that they definitely were added on over the years from the different sections that you can see in the photos. And there's the second floor reflecting that same information. Over at your middle school, everything's from the same construction year of 1969 with a few sections that were remodeled in 1988. But again, not a lot of major upgrades done to that facility. And over in the elementary, main section constructed in 1961 with additions put on in 1992 and 2008 and a small kitchen remodel. So just giving you an idea of when the buildings were built and how old that infrastructure is. So we take that infrastructure and we compare it to what ASHRAE says is its useful life. ASHRAE is an organization of industry experts, and they do research and they put out standards relating to building efficiency and indoor air quality. So we take that life expectancy and we compare it to the life expectancy of the equipment in your building. And it creates, we like to put it in a bar chart so it's a little bit easier to see. So the equipment that's beyond its useful life is highlighted in red. Now I like to say just because it's beyond that useful life doesn't mean you have to go out and replace it tomorrow and it's going to start breaking down. I like to compare it to your car. Once your car gets beyond its warranty period, you're probably going to have to bring it into the shop a little more. Maybe it's a little less reliable, and you're going to be putting more money into making sure that it keeps running. And the same thing happens to the infrastructure in your building. As it gets older beyond that useful life, it's going to take more money and more time to make sure that that equipment keeps running. After we've looked at the age of the equipment, we start looking at how well is it supporting the educational environment? Is it able to operate the way it was designed? How well has it been maintained? And I have to give the maintenance staff over at West Delaware, Gary and his team, some big thank yous or kudos for how well he's been able to keep up with some of the infrastructure in your building. He has a really good handle on what's out there, but it's definitely a lot for him and his team to maintain. So if you see him around, make sure to thank him for everything he does for the district. So we take that asset condition assessment and we compare it, wrap that in with the age, and we pull together a spreadsheet looks like this. This is a little busy, I know that, but we take that, the life expectancy, the age, how well it's being able to operate and support education, and come up with an overall asset condition assessment. Now I'm going to go to the next slide because I think this is a little busy. I'm going to boil it down to more of a summary. So when we look at overall infrastructure in the building and each of those systems, this is the different levels that they're at. So you can see that. Quite a few in alarm and alert. Most of that is in that aging section of the building, and then you've got the acceptable and caution in your newer 2006, 2008 areas. Over in your middle school, you can see the bar chart again. Aging infrastructure that originally constructed in 1969, and you can see on those bars which equipment has not been replaced. For example, you've got some old aging air handlers, unit ventilators, control systems, things like that. And I'll go into more details about some of that later on. And then looking at that system as a whole, alarm and alert about half, and some acceptable and caution. So this would be things like the remodeled areas, and I know boilers were more recently replaced in that facility, so some of that gets factored into this as well. Lambert Elementary, original construction in 1961 with a few additions put on there. You can see those boilers are original along with the steam distribution, older windows and things like that in that building. And here is the breakdown of that facility as a whole. And then lastly, Hawk Center, a newer building to the district, but I know the construction of the building isn't new. And there's the asset condition assessment for that facility. Some aging windows, aging floor tiles, and the overall condition of that building. I'm going to stop briefly and ask if there are questions about this. Yeah. I know, as Tom mentioned, if you put a comment in the chat, I know they'll jump in and let me know too as well. So, looking more specifically at that infrastructure, your boilers are past their useful life, and at the elementary, they are steam, which means there's a lot more maintenance that goes into them. Things to be aware of as we're working through this. Your electrical systems were original to the construction of the buildings and haven't been updated. When we think about when these were designed, they didn't have smart boards, computers, tablets, cell phones. And so as we look at what education is becoming, all the technology that's being worked in the classrooms today, those distribution systems weren't sized to handle those loads. As you can see, we've got many comments. I've highlighted a few here on the screen from the staff indicating the challenges that they're having because of those outdated systems and trying to use those with the modern technology. Plumbing systems is something that was brought up specifically by your maintenance staff. I know you've got a staff comment on there as well that they're noticing it, but there's concerns is that system is deteriorating, and that's something that they brought up as a concern for an infrastructure and deterioration for us to capture. That's what I had for infrastructure. I'm going to switch over into learning environment, which is really why we have a school, right? It's to educate children. So we break down the building and how it supports education into 5 main categories. And I'm going to stop at the end of each of these and ask if there are questions, and if Tom wants to have discussions with the group at that point, he certainly can do that as well. The first one I want to cover is indoor air quality and ventilation. There are many studies linking indoor air quality and ventilation to student absenteeism and performance. The first one I really want to reference was done by Berkeley National Laboratory back in 2013. What that study found was that CO2 levels above 2,500 parts per million, there were diminished cognitive function. So you can see on this bar chart, I know it's a little busy, or I guess it's not a bar chart, but you can see on the chart, initiative, breadth of approach, basic strategy. These are all cognitive functions that are diminished when the CO2 levels rise too high in the space. So when that relates over into an educational setting, when you have a student in a classroom that's trying to absorb new information, maybe they're taking a test and they're trying to stay alert and really engage in the lessons, that gets hard when the CO2 levels are elevated. This is something to be aware of when we're working through looking at building infrastructure. We went out and took CO2 readings in all of the facilities. Now I know the red can sometimes seem a little daunting. These spaces are not dangerous to be in. I would have no trouble standing in that space all day. I'm not concerned about that, but you will see students will have that diminished cognitive function. So they might be a little sleepy, they might not be less alert. So something that we found walking through your buildings. Now, the reason that this is happening is because you have unit ventilator technology. And I'm going to keep going on these slides so we can get to what I can show you a picture of what those look like. It's kind of nice when we meet in the facilities because then I can usually point to one somewhere when we go on our tours, but I'll show you a picture for this evening. So this is what they look like. They're just a box that's on the side of the building on an outside wall. And they're notorious for not being able to bring in enough ventilation into the space. They don't circulate the air thoroughly through the classroom. They're noisy, so a lot of times teachers will ask to get them turned off, which then you're cutting off the amount of ventilation you did have in the space. So there's a lot of drawbacks to having that equipment in an educational setting, but we do see it quite often. It's very common. And there's a lot of comments throughout the slide deck. You'll see we sent out a building occupant survey, and there were a lot of comments from the staff about how these unit ventilators are really affecting their classroom environments. We have an HVAC map just so I can show you where the unit ventilators are located in the building. The gray areas, that's your new space, very capable of providing plenty of fresh air. It's very comfortable in there for the occupants. When you see the areas that are the red boxes, those are all the areas that are served by unit ventilators. So it's noisy, stuffy, the CO2 levels are going to be a little higher. And here's what you're seeing on the second floor with that. Over at your middle school, again, higher elevated CO2 levels, and you'll see the same thing with the HVAC map in this building. Here is that HVAC map, lots of unit ventilators in that building as well.
Sharon, could you just mention, when we're looking at that CO2 map, some of the rooms are colored and some are not. Could you maybe just mention, why we're not seeing anything in a few of those?
Sure. Yep, I can. So if it's white, that means we did not test the area. That could have, it's usually, typically because there were no occupants in the space. Without occupants in the space, CO2 levels aren't going to rise. So we did not test in there if there were no occupants, or maybe there was something going on in the classroom that we couldn't interrupt. We do try not to interrupt the classroom environments too much when we go through and do our testing. So. There's the CO2, or the HVAC map of your middle school. And then looking at your elementary, here is the map of your elementary. You do have some areas in this building that have newer equipment down in the commons and up in this addition over here. That equipment is designed to provide ventilation, but you've got some issues with your control system. So we've got some recommendations to be able to go in and fix that to make sure that we're bringing those levels down. And here is the HVAC map over in that elementary. So you can see where the unit ventilators are. It's just really tough to be able to provide ventilation with that technology. When we take our CO2 readings, it is a snapshot in time. And the CO2 level is going to vary depending on the number of people in the space, as Tom, you had asked about us going in and not testing spaces that are white, or identifying why spaces are white. As students are in that space for a longer period of time, the CO2 levels are going to rise. The more active they are and things like that is going to affect this. So here is one room in your elementary school, and you can see maybe there's periods where they had lunch or recess and they came back into the classroom, and it just kept rising until about 3 p.m. and then you see a rapid decrease. And then carrying on into the morning hours of Tuesday morning, and you can see when those students came back in the classroom. And for your reference, an outside air has a CO2 parts per million of between 350 and 400. So you have that reference to what's outside versus what's going on in the classrooms. And when you've got a piece of mechanical equipment that's able to ventilate that space properly, you won't see levels up this high. They'll be able to really bring fresh air in enough and get rid of some of that CO2. I'm going to pause. I'm going to switch over to temperature and humidity next. So are there questions about ventilation, unit ventilators for me?
There's one general question. The answer to it is yes. Will all participants get a copy of this presentation so they can spend a little more time looking through it? The answer is yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and let me just provide some additional information on that. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about our upcoming meetings. We're going to spend our entire meeting next week talking about this information that Sharon's presenting, and you'll have a bunch of data to be able to take a look at. And it's a lot to try to crunch through in a 15-minute period if we were to do that tonight. And so we're going to dedicate an entire meeting to having an opportunity to talk through this stuff and try to understand it. After this meeting, you will get a copy of this presentation with the information that Sharon's got here. We also have an additional handout that'll be emailed to you that has more specific data in it that you'll have an opportunity to take a look through over the course of the week. We'll also use that next week when we're talking, and then you'll have that for future reference as we continue through our process. So you'll have access to a bunch of data as we go through these next 2 meetings. And Sharon, I believe, has agreed to come back and see us next week as well, just in case there's questions or other things that we want to talk to her about. So, thanks, Sharon, for letting me interject that.
No problem. Absolutely. Okay. If it's awkward silence, I'm sorry. I'm just giving everyone an opportunity to come off mute. So, all right, I will keep rolling here. The next category is temperature and humidity. I know that we all know what it feels like to be in a space where it's hot, it's humid. It makes us feel lethargic, we're not attentive, maybe we want to take a nap. And the same thing happens in an educational setting to students and staff. There's been studies done that show that student performance is improved when temperatures are reduced in the space, and occupants have control over what that is. Looking at your high school, I wanted to give you an idea of where dehumidification or cooling is available in the buildings. So over at your high school, you have cooling in all of the new areas, but the older sections of the building, it's been provided in spaces where it's needed, so it's not available throughout. And you can see you've got staff comments about not only the heat affecting learning, but also allergies and some of the technology. And here is that map up on the second floor. Over at your middle school, you do have cooling throughout the building here, but I do want to talk about the limitations of this system. It is something called a two-pipe system. What that means is it can either be in heating mode or cooling mode, but it's very hard to switch between the two. What happens is in heating mode, you've got 140, 160 degree water, and in cooling mode, it's 45. So you can only switch it over every so often. Usually it's done 2 times a year. So if you get into the fall and it's starting to get a little cold, and you switch over to heating mode, and then you get a heat wave, essentially, you're kind of stuck. You don't have that cooling available because you already switched over to heating. So that's why if you get some of the comments over in the middle school about not having dehumidification available, that's where that's coming from. The other limitation there is because they're unit vents, they have a hard time dehumidifying. So while the air might feel cool, if it's really wet and humid, it has a hard time pulling all of the moisture out of the air to make it comfortable. And here is the map over at the elementary school. So the newer additions having cooling and the rest of the building not. And you've got some staff comments about room temperatures reaching 80 degrees, no airflow, which should be those unit ventilators. As I said, just not circulating the air. So if it's really hot and there's not a lot of airflow in there, it just definitely gets uncomfortable for everyone using those spaces. I want to switch over from cooling to heating. With your heating systems, I mentioned earlier that you have steam boilers. You have steam boilers in every facility and hot water in your middle school. But with the steam system, there's a lot more maintenance that's required of it, and it's a lot harder to control. Those buildings you see a lot of steam systems with buildings that are overheating. And the solution to that with the occupants is to open a window. And now you're letting just all that heat out, but they're getting hot, and that's how they're controlling their temperature and their environment. The other piece that you have going on in these buildings is that you have a lot of pneumatic controls. I talked about Gary and his team having a lot to keep up with to maintain. Pneumatic controls have to be recalibrated or replaced every few years, and you have that in a lot of your buildings. And when it starts to go out of calibration, that's when you start getting all of those issues with being able to control your temperature. So you've really got 2 things going on in the spaces with both the steam systems and your control system that's causing your occupants not to be able to control their temperature. So maps of where those control systems are. Everything that's in orange is areas that your maintenance staff isn't able to remotely check and monitor. They have to go out to each individual space and look at that piece of equipment face to face. And here is space temperatures. I want to give you a point of reference. When we take these at the same time that we do the CO2 readings, and they're done really in the peak of winter. So we like it to be really nice and cold outside. So when these were taken, I think it was about 20 degrees outside. And you can see some of these spaces are between 76 and 78 degrees. We've got rooms that windows are starting to be open and things like that. That can be quite hot for building occupants. And you can see there's a note about having to open the windows to control temperature. And here's the second floor, 76 to 78 degrees, and the windows are open, which is going to affect your utility usage as well. And I can get back into that a little bit later in the presentation. And definitely comments from your staff about how that's affecting their learning environments and just being hot and opening windows. In your middle school, it's entirely pneumatic control, so there's no energy management system in that facility. And here are the space temperatures, not as hot as the high school. That second floor, 74 to 76 degrees, which can feel a little warm in the winter. And there's comments about dressing in layers. So if one space is hot, you take the layer off, go into another room and it's cold, you put the layer back on, and opening those windows and whatnot just to control temperature in the spaces. And over at the elementary, lots of pneumatic controls, and then the spaces in blue are local controls. So that would be similar to the thermostat that you have in your house. And space temperatures over at the elementary. And these look pretty good. But again, we've got some notes about individual temperature control with those pneumatics, that's tough. And then also the poor ventilation from those unit ventilators. I mentioned with the heating, the rooms being so hot and having the windows open, you're spending a lot on utility use because that's happening. When I look at school facilities, typically I like to see usage anywhere from 80 cents to $1 when they've got full cooling and proper ventilation. In your buildings, you've got approximately half of your buildings have cooling. Aggregate, and then you have some high CO2 levels in the majority of your spaces. So when I see your utility usage up at $1 at your high school, like $1.17 at your middle school, $1.40 at your elementary, that tells me that you're spending a lot of utility dollars, but they're not being really utilized in your classroom. So being able to do some updates to your infrastructure, you'll be able to really direct those utility dollars effectively into providing, really good air quality, good temperature control, and ultimately save some money as well. I'm going to pause here, so I'm going to switch categories again. So I don't know if Tom, if you want to do any groups, or I will also wait for people to come off mute.
So at this point, I guess I'd love to hear from folks. Is there anything surprising here about what you're hearing? I know we went through the last 3 weeks hearing from principals and what they're doing in their buildings and what some of the things are that hold them back. These things that we're talking about here, they maybe touched on a little bit, but are kind of newer concepts to what we've been talking about as a group. What are people thinking about as you're hearing this information from Sharon? Is there anything that stands out as being surprising to you, or maybe not surprising based on what your experiences are at the school?
I must be doing a really good job of explaining.
Hey, Sharon.
Yes.
This is Brian here. You got the cost per square foot and everything else, and you were talking about utility spend, energy management earlier. Could you explain just maybe a little bit more about how energy management and how it affects the overall utility spend, and then the impact that has on the general fund of the school district?
I can, yep. So I think there's kind of 2 different pieces there. I'm going to tackle the energy management piece first and then move over into the utility expenditures and what that means for the general fund in the district. The energy management system is essentially a computer. It's the brain of your building. So when you install an energy management system, you're able to do scheduling. So if you've got people using the gym in the evening, you can schedule the gym to run when we're there. If you've got and then depending on the weather, you can start a little bit earlier to make sure the classrooms are heated up for when the students get there versus running it on a wider schedule to make sure that it's maintained anytime the building occupants are there. So that's done a lot with the pneumatic systems that you're seeing. So being able to have that brain in your facility to be able to schedule, you can remotely monitor. So you can say, all right, if you get a call from a teacher, you know which room it's in, you can pull it up on the computer, see what temperature it is, you can see if the fan's running, you can see if the heating's on. Those are things that your maintenance staff can't do the way it is right now. They have to physically go out, open the piece of equipment, measure the temperature readings themselves. And so it takes a lot longer and it's a lot harder to troubleshoot without it. So installing one of those, you're able to take better control of your building and reduce your utility usage. What that means is when you're bringing your utility usage down, that's money that's going to be more, that's available in your general fund. Right now, your general fund is being used to pay those utility bills. So if you're paying less, there's more money available going into your education that's available to your admin and your teaching staff to really provide for curriculum and on other things that you'd rather be spending the money on.
Sharon, I have one question here. Is March of 2019 the only data that you have?
March of 2019. I'm sorry, where's that coming from, Brian?
It's coming from Steve Warren, one of the group, one of the participants. Just a question.
Can you be more specific? I'm sorry. Is it related to utility usage or some of the other data?
Steve, don't be afraid to speak up.
Yeah.
I believe that was on one of the slides previous to this. It said March 9th or something like that, March 9th and March 12th of 2019.
Sharon, this is Lynette.
Yeah.
I think the reason it's probably in March is, and I don't know how much this committee knows as well, is you guys were hired to do this assessment last year, and it's just taken, I mean, there's just been a lot of steps to it. So that would have been about the time frame that you were in our buildings to do the initial assessment for the board. And then the board got the information, and then the board put together this committee. So there's been lots of steps going up to this point. And March would have been about the time you guys would have been coming in through our buildings of last year.
Okay.
So March was the only data received.
Okay. Is it in reference to this CO2 log?
Yes.
Okay. Yep. When we put the logger out, yes, we launched it and we captured a one day's worth of data.
Okay.
Yep.
So could I clarify, this is Kristen too, Kristen Rickey. It's a great question to try to figure out, when was this and all of that. I think that like logging those specific readings around that one day where you guys came, or a course of a couple of days when you were visiting the buildings, the things like the cost of utilities and energy costs and things like that. Sharon, remind me, was that based on like billing for the year or the month or something? It was long term, it wasn't a one-day billing. So the data in the classrooms, yeah, that was 1 or 2 days. The billing is over a bigger span of time. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. And the data that we're seeing from that testing really supports, like the utility usage supports seeing that for more than 1 day. So looking at the infrastructure you have in the facility, the readings that we found, the control systems that you have, it's safe to assume that that's happening consistently. And that's where your utility usage is reflecting that as well.
And if I could just jump in with one more thing, because some people may be aware of this and some aren't. So I think it'd be helpful to know as we proceed with the conversations as well. Sharon made reference to the fact that when you have to pay for extra electricity and things like that, heat that's going out the windows because the windows are open, that comes away from funds that we could spend on education. Absolutely, that's true, but it's even more true, I guess, because it's exaggerated because of the way funding works in Iowa. So we have different funds that can do different things, and replacing our systems, remodeling the building and all that sort of thing comes out of our physical plant funds or our sales tax funds. But paying the electric bill comes out of our general fund, and general fund is how we pay teachers and buy instructional materials and curriculum and so on. So if we can fix systems out of the physical plant fund, it leaves extra money in the other fund. So people might be thinking, well, if you have to pay money to fix a system and then you save money, isn't that the same? No, because you pay it out of one fund and it saves money in the general fund, which is a different fund. So that might be helpful to understand that difference.
I think some good discussion. I like the questions and clarifications. I think that's great.
There's another question up there, Sharon, and it says if the average cost per square foot were between 80 cents and $1 versus where it is now, what would the overall difference be annually? And I'm not sure if that's an easy calculation that you might have or that we can do, or if that might be something we need to kind of come back and take a look at for next week. Are
they asking about like the potential savings from, is that what the
Yeah,
question
that
is?
was my
I suspect,
question.
but Dan,
Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine.
I just typed it down quick so I wouldn't forget when everybody else was talking, but I basically just wondering how much we could save in the general fund with some of the upgrades necessary to get it to that desired level. Because it looks like there are only 1 or 2 of the facilities are actually within your desired range that they were showing, you're suggesting, Sharon. I'm just asking if we could get all the facilities into that range, what would the annual difference be in the general fund, or what would it mean to the general fund and cost avoidance?
Right. I could get that for you. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it also depends on what systems you're installing. But yeah, looking at being able to bring that down and how large the buildings are, yeah, we can figure that out. But I think, Tom, as you work through later in this process and you get into some of that cost information, I think we can, will that be made available? I think so. But.
Yeah, as we get to looking at some of the costs, it's a great question, Dan. We always struggle with what's the right point in the process to bring that information in, you know. But we'll definitely get that, and we'll see if we can at least get some
Like
answer
rough,
around that for next week when we have some more conversation about the data. But I get what you're saying, and it's a great question.
The real answer to your question is yes, we have that available and we can get it to you. We can calculate that. We've done it for any number of schools.
Yep. All right, I'm gonna keep clicking forward here until I get up to where I was. Anyone has any other questions, please feel free before I get up. I think I'm there. All right. This is where we were at with the lighting. So we look at lighting systems. Lighting has a big impact on how we perceive our environment. When we think about when the sun starts to go down, we get tired, it's ready for bed, it comes up, we wake up, we're nice and alert. When you're in a classroom setting, when the lights are nice and bright and the color is more of a bluish tint, the students are nice and alert and awake. If the lights are low, maybe they're a little bit more of a cooler shade. Those students are going to be less alert. So it definitely has an impact on what's going on in those classrooms. We went out and we took light level readings in the buildings. You can see anything that's got a red light bulb to it is a space that is under the recommended light level range. Yellow is something that's above, so the occupants are doing well, but it's potential for saving some energy by reducing that output. And then green is right in the range that we would be looking for when we're doing these surveys. And here is your middle school. Lots of spaces right within range. I think there's just 2 of them that are above or below that we'd like to see with the recommended levels. You do have a comment from one of the staff members about the flickering of the lights. We do have fluorescent technology in all the buildings. And what happens with the fluorescent technology, as they get to the end of their life and those ballasts start to go out, the lights will start to flicker. I'm sure most of you have seen a flickering light before, and it can be very distracting, especially if you're sitting in that space all day. With converting over to an LED system, as that bulb or that lamp gets to the end of its life, the output starts to reduce, and it won't ever start to flicker. So there's definitely some advantages going that way when you're looking at comments like this from your staff. And here is your elementary school. I'm sure many of you have been in that gym or that lunchroom. It definitely is a dim space. Lots of other spaces that are at or above the ranges. And I've got a couple of pictures in here of the lights in the buildings. You do have fixtures that are original. Aesthetically, not always nice and fresh and new looking, but they do serve their function. They've gotten lots of life out of them. With the fluorescent technology, you'll see a couple different shades of light color out of those tubes. Moving over to an LED, all of the lighting color will be the same. It's more closely resembles natural light, so it's easier on the occupants. You save a lot in utility dollars, but also in maintenance because you're getting rid of the ballast. So there's a lot of advantages to going over to an LED type system. And I'm wrapping up lighting. I know the last couple of categories are a little shorter than my first few. Any questions? No? All right. Next is acoustics. Thinking about a classroom, there is a lot of teaching and interaction that happens verbally. And so if you've got a lot of background noise, it makes that inner exchange a lot more difficult. So we went out and took sound readings. Now I mentioned that unit ventilators are fairly noisy, and you can see the levels that we found in the spaces. We've got quite a few staff comments that are talking about how the noise level, they have to talk over it or it's distracting to the and the learning that's going on in those spaces. And here over at your middle school, this is your library space. Again, another staff comment. This one was quite loud. It goes from 55 all the way up to 61 in that area. And then over at your elementary. And the unit ventilators, again, are notorious for being very noisy in the spaces. And that's it for the sound section. Any question about acoustics or sound or unit ventilators in general? I know I talk about them a lot. So. All right, I will keep going. This is the last category I'm going to go through is aesthetics and building quality. While it doesn't directly affect the learning environment, we've gotten a lot of feedback from the districts we're working with that they take a lot of pride in their buildings and they really invest in their education and they want to show their students that they're really investing in them. So this is something that really resonates with that message. So working and looking at the grounds of the buildings. There are issues with stormwater management. So it rains, the snow melts, and it starts to accumulate. You get some ponding, it gets muddy. You can see on this next picture, if it sits over by the building foundation, it starts to erode. So looking at potential solutions for directing water away from the building foundation, making sure it's not sitting and creating kind of those soupy, slushy areas. You've got areas of concrete that are cracked or pitting, creating slips and trip hazards. As water gets in those cracks and freezes and unthaws, those cracks become bigger. Things to keep in mind. Looking at some of your asphalt. Over at the middle school, you can see a nice large ponding area here and some of the cracks happening there. The original windows, I had talked about that at the beginning of the presentation, just showing some of the deterioration with that. Door frames, deteriorated doors. And on the next slide, you can see what happens. These are areas that weather stripping could be replaced. That's air filtration, so potentials for energy savings. Deteriorated caulking. This is something definitely to pay attention to as well as these things on the next slide, making sure that tuck pointing is addressed. Anytime water is able to get into the building cavity, you get potential for lots of issues. So just making sure that the building envelope is sealed up and water isn't able to get into that cavity can be quite important. Security systems, you don't have a fully secured entry, excuse me, over at your middle school. So figuring out how do we direct visitors into the office before they have access to the rest of the building, making sure that the building's nice and secure for students and staff. Door monitoring, this is the card access, expanding that and upgrading it so it's easier for staff to be able to tell who's going in and out of the building and at what times. Upgrading security cameras, expanding coverage to be able to monitor the facilities. I know safety and security are really important when we look at school buildings. Capital equipment, you have some deteriorated lockers. You can see they've got some rusting at the bottom and they've definitely seen a lot of life. Here is some damaged restroom stalls. Original clock systems that have starting to deteriorate and maybe not functioning. Damaged floor tile, and some of these are asbestos. I'll get into some of that in just a bit. buckled carpet, deteriorated carpet, things that it would be nice to be able to go on a tour, but we're going to have to do pictures in the interim here. Asbestos flooring. If it's not disturbed as it is now, it's perfectly fine, but if you wanted to go in and do something more modern, or if this does start to break down, it would need to be abated. Ceilings, you've got areas with stained ceiling tiles, original ceiling tiles that are starting to discolor and warp a little bit, especially as we look at areas of the building that don't have cooling. You will get swaying in those ceiling tiles. Here's a cracked ceiling tile over at the Hawk Center. Interior doors, most of these are original to the building, and what they've seen a lot of life. They've gotten really good use, but they're also heavily used, so they are starting to deteriorate. The kids can be pretty hard on the, the finishes in these facilities. And here is casework and cabinetry, some deterioration there. You've got bleachers that don't have ADA accessibility over at your middle school. And this is my last slide for this evening. We've got some older wash basins that could be upgraded, and sinks, or excuse me, drinking fountains that could be retrofitted to be ADA accessible. And you can have bottle fillers on there now too. I know a lot of students and staff really like the fountains with the bottle fillers built in. So yeah, moving in towards some of those more modern fixtures. With that, I'm going to ask if there are additional questions for this evening from me. Yeah. Yeah.
Kristen was talking about at the beginning of the meeting the concept of Zoom meeting fatigue. Perhaps we need to review that document a little closer, and that's what's happening to us here as well. Anyway, Sharon, I'm wondering, could you comment just briefly? I know we don't know a lot at this point about COVID-19 and some of those things, but we all hear a lot of rumors about what might be coming down the pike as far as, needs from that standpoint. Could you just comment, is there any of the stuff that you talked about in particular, like HVAC and ventilation or whatever, that might be related to COVID-19, or even just maybe the idea of, like virus mitigation? We don't like kids to be out of school for any reason, really, due to sickness. And how much does a ventilation and HVAC system play into either COVID-19 or not even?
That's a great question, and definitely timely. Right now, we have a team of engineers in-house right now, actually really digging into exactly that issue, and what we're coming up with are ways to mitigate basically infection. Obviously, you're never going to keep it from spreading completely, but just ways to reduce it and kind of start to inhibit transfers. So when you look at the HVAC system and you're moving into some of those central systems, it's a lot easier to put things like ionization, which will break down pathogens as they get into the ductwork, essentially making those excuse me, COVID germs ineffective. And I say COVID, they haven't done testing on this specific strain, but the previous ones. And then also they've got technology like UV light that they can put in the ductwork that will also break that down. There's also other things that we're looking at in terms of district, like putting in self-sanitizing surfaces like door hardware, plexiglass at check-in counters and things like that. So there are quite a few options. We haven't gone over any of that with the district yet, but it's definitely, it's something that's very timely. It's just coming up now, and we're really starting to dig into it. So does that answer some of your questions, Tom?
Yeah, and I guess maybe even just the idea that the more that you go away from the unit ventilator, individual room type of concept to, some of the other ways of doing HVAC and ventilation that, as you said, it's easier to help control some of those things, whether it's COVID-19 or just other, viruses,
flu
and stuff
germs,
like that.
yeah, any particulate in the space. You can put some of those technologies in the space. They're a lot more expensive, still effective, but yeah, there are ways to do it with the unitary systems versus the central. It's just easier to do it with that central system. So, but the main thing is that you're going to get a lot better indoor air quality with those central systems, because you're going to be able to bring in the fresh air. You're going to be able to dilute it. You're being able to bring in the stuff that's in the space out of the building and really get more of an air exchange rate than you would have otherwise.
I know some of you must have something going around in your head on this. We heard from a couple. We don't want to institute, one comment required per person before you leave the meeting. But anyone else have anything that they want to just even comment on if it's not a question?
I have a question about the heat pump that goes for the high school is also that goes to the newer part of the high school, and then you got the boilers for the older part of the high school. Can those be integrated together, or do they have to be separately controlled? Is that marriage able to happen when you have heat pumps in one part and the boilers in the other part? Is it possible, or do you have to make both of them a heat pump system to be able to put the controls in that would mitigate the fluctuations in temperatures?
Mm-hmm. A great question. And no, you don't. You don't have to have matching systems. Basically, when you put the energy management system or the brain, and when you install that and connect up all the equipment, it can take whatever system you put in there. So you can take your existing boilers and hook that up to energy management, be able to schedule them and control them. It wouldn't need to be on that heat pump system. And if you were to go in and take out like the section of unit ventilators and put in a different technology, let's say you went to central air handling systems with hot water and chilled water or DX, and sorry if I'm getting a little technical, but if you did that type of a system rather than a heat pump, it would still work with that as well. So yeah, there's definitely, you're not stuck with one type of system being able to control the building.
Another question I have is, how hard would it be to retrofit the schools from the boiler system? Because I assume the boilers today are much more compact and more efficient. Mm-hmm. How do you retrofit your rooms into this new heat and cooling system without tearing up everything that would make it unfeasible to do it effectively, cost effectively?
Mm-hmm. When it is expensive going from a steam system into hot water, but there's a lot of advantages to doing that. I know we talk quite a bit about that. But when you look at like the footprint of the boiler, it's actually a lot easier to take the big boilers out and go in with the new, smaller, modern boilers. They'll actually fit down a hallway in most cases, versus if you're going to replace them with the older style, you have a lot harder time getting those into those rooms. So that is a hurdle that's a lot easier going to hot water. But when you look at the infrastructure outside of that boiler room, you have to take out all of the steam piping and all of those, the unit ventilators or the boxes in the classrooms. You have to take all of that out and put in new. So it's definitely a lot of work to go in and run new hot water piping. You put in new air handling equipment, you put in ductwork, you put in thermostats, and a lot of times the ceilings get opened up. So you're doing new lighting and things like that at the same time. So it's definitely a big project to go down that road. It definitely has its advantages. We have a lot of districts that do that just because of the benefits for indoor air quality and controllability and their utility usage, and really just making those buildings comfortable and supporting education. But it is a project to go through and do that.
Sharon, I know a question that might be on some people's minds, and it's fair if you're not prepared to answer this necessarily. It sometimes, you know, dovetails into some of the work of our architects. But I know, and you know, in some of these previous processes, what we talk about retrofitting a building and doing just the work that you were talking about, and it's a big project, and it's not cheap to do. There's some definite paybacks to it, but you kind of add up all the different things that you might want to do to a building, and then you kind of ask yourself, and I think we've seen it even in some of our small group conversations here, is, you know, at what point, what's that break point, you know, about abandoning that and going to a new building. But a lot of our customers have really good infrastructure in place. You know, the bones are great. Do you have anything that you could comment on as far as the infrastructure here? You know, as to, you know, how good is the infrastructure? I mean, this. Do they have good bones?
Do they have good bones? Yes, you have good bones. And now I do kind of wish we had an architect with that could go through and do this conversation
It's fair
justice.
if you don't. We can bring somebody in to better answer that question, but in case the conversation's been had.
Yeah. Yes. So if you bring in an architect for this conversation, they go into like the difference between a 25 and a 50 and a 100-year building. And you hear a lot. They don't build buildings like they used to. They're not built to last the test of time as they were back in, you know, like the 50s and 60s and sometimes 20s and 30s. And you've got buildings that were built in that era, so the bones are good. Yeah, so you'll see a lot of benefits to keeping them versus going with a new building. And obviously you'd have to be the ones making that kind of a decision, but yeah, we see a lot of districts that use their existing facilities just because the construction quality is good. And when they were built, they were really built to last. So yeah, and you've got buildings from that era. So does that help?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and we've seen some buildings that you'd be surprised are even still standing almost.
Yeah.
And from a school standpoint, it's kind of sad almost, you know, that some districts are having to use that infrastructure. But I've always been impressed walking through West Delaware's buildings, that they look good, and so I'm not surprised to hear you say that. But I know that's a question that a lot of people have on their mind a lot of times, and so thanks.
Yeah, but as I said, you get if the architects join, they can absolutely answer that do it more justice than I did. So leave that out there.
Other questions or comments from folks? Is there anything that we missed perhaps in Sharon's presentation relative to kind of the utilities and infrastructure things here that you would like to try to have Sharon come back and maybe address as best as she can, that you didn't see here?
And I got the utility savings question, so that one's on my list.
I know when the place I work, we went to the lighting that's really cost efficient and really high in energy savings. And I know we got a lot of rebates from the Alliant Energy because we did go to this system. Is those rebates and stuff still available for the like a school to use? And would you have any idea how much savings a school could make on doing the those LED lights and all the stuff that's so much better nowadays? And if we could get those rebates, and how much that would save us in the long haul?
Rebates are definitely available. Going to LED. They do change every year or two, depending on what programs are out there. But yeah, I can look in to see what's available for the district for next time. Absolutely, and come back with something for you.
When we get into talking about financing, we'll have a little bit more conversation around some of the cost things. But Sharon, is it is true that well, in Iowa, you know, you've got the ability to finance projects through a bond referendum. You've got the ability to use saved funds for certain things. You've got the ability to use Pebble for certain things. And then there are some other financing options for some of those energy savings projects at times as well. Correct, Sharon?
Do you mind if I kick that one over to Brian to talk funding?
Yeah, actually, Tom and group, the easiest way to finance projects in the state of Iowa is through 3 different ways. You got voted PEPL. You've got that you can bond against the future revenue, just like you can with SAVE, or you have a general referendum for the sale of general obligation bonds. Now, with regards to rebates, besides just LED rebates, you can also get rebates based upon other heating and cooling systems that are installed throughout the school district too. So you're not just limited to lights. You can also look at rebates from new heating systems and new cooling systems. And one of the other things that we're also looking at, and our architects are definitely working at right now, is how do we reopen the school? How do we look at the school when we come back? How do we ensure that our schools are safe and families are willing to come back to that? I'm a school board member myself in my own school district, and those are topics we're talking about right now. How do we do this? How do we have the functionality of the school building? How do we have the educational environment? How do we interact? How do we come into the school? How do we eat lunches? And how we're moving forward? And those are questions that every school district across the state of Iowa is answering or asking themselves right now. And not only that, but then how do we integrate in with learning? LED lighting, we talk about savings right there through energy and such, but then we also can talk about, and Sharon was sharing this earlier, about the flickering of the lights. When the old fluorescent lights start getting to the end of their useful life, we see those lights going on and off. But a child that has autism, even when that light bulb is brand new, they're seeing the flickering of that light. So how do we improve their learning environment? Those are all different things, and it all pulls into this process right here of what's best for West Delaware. Where do we see the future of West Delaware, and how do we make that happen? So there's several different things right here to be looking at as we go throughout. But to answer your original question, there's 3 basic methods. Voted PEPL, which they can bond against, SAVE, which you can bond against, or you can have a general obligation fund. Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I for picking that up. Apparently, my internet locked up there for a minute, and so I must have gotten cut off in the middle. I was talking, and everybody's picture was completely still, so I knew something had happened. Anyway, yes, and then depending on what type of project it is, there are some energy savings that can sometimes be bonded against as well outside of those programs, I guess is what I was getting to. So the fact is that there are many different things that we can take a look at to be able to fund some of the projects that are here, and it doesn't all necessarily have to be into a great big fat referendum necessarily, and we'll have some conversations about that. But I just want folks to know that we're going to help the district and have those conversations with you guys about being as wise as we can with how we spend potential money and what the return of that can be.
I do have another question. Is there anything different a school has to think about when looking at infrastructure that is different than what we have to do for our own homes?
And I would say that there definitely is. When you look at how a school is used, there's a lot more occupants, and the activities are a lot more varied. So it's more densely populated, which means you're going to have to provide more outside air, keep that air circulating, the air exchange higher than you would in your house. And it goes back to also that technology piece. When you think about 30 kids in a classroom, all on the Wi-Fi, all using that electrical power source, it's something that most of us don't have in our homes. So that network has to be a lot more powerful, and the electrical system has to be sized for that. So those are just a couple of the examples, but definitely looking at how is the building being used by the occupants is going to be a lot different than the house. So
This is
Actually,
Kristen, if
anytime
I
you have-
could.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Brian, if I could jump in too. Those are all obviously very true. The other thing that we think about in schools that lots of times you don't think about and people, the general public doesn't realize, is that we have legal requirements for things like architects, and that's a good thing when you're designing a building this size. But we have requirements for, you know, fire codes, sprinkler systems, architects, that a lot of times people don't have. So like when we built our bus barn, I think some people were surprised by how expensive it was. And they thought, well, if I just put up a pole building on my farm, it doesn't cost $100 or whatever it cost. I don't remember now. That's because there are a lot more requirements for inspections and approvals and that sort of thing, time frames that take longer and things like that.
Yeah, anytime you have a public building that's used by the public, you're in a different category than you are in your own house. So I have another question. Is the geothermal well field at the high school capable of providing service for the entire campus?
And I haven't looked into the size, but I would assume when the designer designed that, they designed it for the size of the building that was built there currently. So I would say no, not that it can't be expanded, assuming that the land is available to put in the wells to be able to expand that system. And the thing about geothermal is it's very expensive to install because of that well field. But no, it would not be sized to the rest of the facility, but could potentially be expanded if you wanted to serve the rest.
Another question, as we talk about funding, Dr. Ricky mentioned about the fund that can be used for updates of the equipment. Do we know how much money is currently available in that fund?
So we do know, and Lynette can get us that figure. I would be amazed if she had it at her fingertips, but maybe she'll pop in a minute. The thing to keep in mind about that is we do use that fund for other things as well, and there's a limited list of things we can use it for. But for example, we use it. We call them SAVE funds. That's our sales tax funds. We use those also to purchase technology. So we're on a rotation with our students being one-to-one on devices and our teachers all having laptops and all the other things, you know, projectors and all that. We're on a rotation of replacing those. I think it's every 5 years. Lynette will correct me if it's 4. I think it's every 5 years. Which is pretty much the life of the computer these days. It needs to be updated. And we devote about $250,000 a year of that money to technology, just straight computer replacement. And then there are some other things too, like we set aside a certain amount for roof repairs every year. And you generally have to buy a school bus every year, which is somewhere between $90,000 and $100,000, because that allows us to replace one of our buses every 13, 14 years, something like that, if we do one every year. So we can get you the numbers on the money. Keep in mind it's used for some other things too. But there is a significant amount of money in there. It's not enough to do everything we need, but it is. So Lynette, I'll be quiet. I don't know if you have that at your fingertips.
I do. We have a little over 4 million sitting in there, closer to 4.5 million between the two funds as of right now. But like Kristen said, we do have, you know, summer projects. The board approved tuck pointing bids for $50,000. Just at the regular board meeting, I had a conversation. We have budgeted right now for 2 school buses. So Gary Funk and I started having that conversation today about, do we need 2? Should we hold off? You know, and one of the concerns that we're starting to see is we get a large chunk of money from our sales tax revenue. And obviously with nobody being allowed to go places, with things being shut down, a lot of people not having jobs, the conversations are already starting. You know, we're not seeing that impact yet, but they're projecting, you know, come next year, even our income into those funds are going to go down anywhere from 10 to 20% is the number that we're starting to hear. And again, straight up estimates, you know, nobody's got the golden ball there, but we do have, and to be honest, we've been saving some money for this purpose as well. Because we knew we want to do something, we want to be able to, we don't want to have to either borrow again for everything or bond for everything. I mean, we want to be able to tell our community that we have money we can put into this too. And if it, you know, we have some that we can spend and just see which way it goes. But that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, about 4 million. And it's once we get into the, you know, the heart of that, it's just, I find it really fascinating about what we spend that money on. So just so the committee knows how we do that, we meet once a month during the school year with Lynette and Joe Haglund, who's our technology director, Gary Funk, and myself. And then principals are invited to that meeting if they want to attend. And we talk about how do we spend that money and what things do we need. And that comes from information throughout the year. Like right now, teachers are putting in requests for summer maintenance. Like, you know, they'll say, the carpet needs to be replaced in my room because it's torn up, or my broken tiles, or my heat doesn't work, or that, you know, that kind of thing. And we sort of prioritize together with the principals and those folks on the team, where does that money need to go? And then throughout the year, we make adjustments. So we may say, well, we need, and it's always amazing to me how big the numbers are. So when we redid our chemistry lab at the high school, one of our science rooms. Lynette's going to jump in if I'm wrong, but to update that science room to today's standards, get new lab stations and technology for student learning, it's about $170,000, Lynette, for that one room. And we have 3 science rooms at the high school. We didn't do anything in the middle school. So it really is nice. There is money in there. It goes pretty fast. We redid the welding lab a couple years before that, and that was about $150,000. So again, like your house, you're thinking, what? You spent $150,000 on a room? But to get the equipment and the supplies and the technology and the new lab stations and, you know, the lighting and the flooring and all that. So, but yeah, to answer, about $4 million is what we have right now.
And I think that's where, you know, kind of what was said earlier too. In our homes, we can rip up flooring or rip up carpet and just put something else down. You know, I can't say 90% because I don't really know, but a good chunk of our school, it seems like every time we need to replace something, it's asbestos. So we have to hire them to come in and abate it, and it takes days, and it's expensive. It costs more to abate it than it does to put the new flooring down.
Yeah. The other thing we use that money for, just so people know, is things like Gary Funk will tell us, the Bobcat is X number of years old, and that's what we use to clear snow all off the sidewalks in the district, and the thing is completely shot. We got to have a new Bobcat. We can't fix it anymore. Okay, how much does a Bobcat cost? And every time my role is to go, really? It's that expensive? And yeah, it is. So we have to buy, you know, equipment like that to maintain the grounds too. So, but it's a great question. We do have some money in there that we can work with. So it's good starting point.
I think one thing that should be clear, Iowa is not that much different than Minnesota. Minnesota had a rainy day fund of $1.5 billion. They are now projecting a $2.4 billion deficit because of the sales tax. So I would anticipate that you're going to get much less money in sales tax revenue this year than you have in the past.
But on a brighter side, and I just did talk with Matt Gillespie of Piper a week ago, and the state of Iowa passed approximately 9 months ago, I think, they started collecting sales tax off of internet sales. So they still don't have a full 12 months worth of data from this. But from what Matt was telling me, the amount of sales tax being gathered from internet sales is perhaps a little bit higher than what was originally expected. So that's a little silver lining in the clouds right there.
Mm-hmm.
There's another question from John. Does the school district, and we've talked about this before, does the school district have any land that isn't in the floodplain so they can build something new?
I don't think so. I don't want to say definitively, so I want, there's board members on here listening as well, and if Lynette, if you think I'm incorrect about this, but no, it's either in the floodplain or the floodway, which is worse than the floodplain from what I'm understanding in terms of building. So of course we have the dry run that runs right through the kind of the practice field there by the high school, by the football field. It looks like we have lots of land behind the middle school, but the dry run kind of comes past there too. Up at the bus barn, we put the bus barn way on that north end of that property because there are floodway issues at the south end of that property. So even though there's quite a bit of land there, it's not really something we could build on. Now, I don't want you to take that as a definitive last word. There might be land. I don't have the map in front of me, but there's not a lot. And that was interesting to me that I heard people say before that we have a lot of land we don't. But like I said, I don't have the map in front of me. There may be some, but not enough to build a building on.
Yeah, we should get a hold of that map so there's
Yeah,
no.
we talked about getting that map, and my apologies that we have not printed off that map and gotten it into your hands. And I'll make a note, and Brian will remind me that we'll get that for next week, so people have a better idea of what that floodplain looks like.
Tom, this is Lynette again. Can you let the committee know how will they get the information that Sharon? Are you going to send an email? How are they going to receive that information? Because there's quite a bit to that that data that was presented today before next week's conversation meeting.
Yep. So we'll send an email that, like we typically do, that has the PDF of today's presentation in it. And then depending on the size, and I don't recall offhand what the size of the PDF, but it's a PDF document as well with the other information in it. Some of it is a repeat of what Sharon went over today, but it's categorized by school. And so Sharon went through and she kind of walked through her presentation based on HVAC and then electrical and then lighting and those types of things. And so information in this other document is by school, and we'll email that as well. We should be able to email it. I don't think that it's too large that we'd have to do something different. But you'll be emailed that document in the next couple days here. So you'll have some time to take a look at it, and then in the next meeting I can probably even just transition over and take a look at what our meeting schedule is going to be here real quick. I think I'm sharing my screen, am I not?
Sure.
Okay. All right, so next week, May 20th is that meeting. We're going to do essentially a data retreat looking at the facility assessment information. And we'll get out into small groups and we'll kind of try to crunch down through some of the data that we've got. We'll take a look at a couple of different categories of that and try to really make sense of what that means relative to what our task is as a task force. And work through that as a group. We aren't going to have any new information per se next week. Sharon will be around to help us if we've got questions or we need some clarifications on some things. Then coming out of that, we're going to take a couple of week break and try to deal with this Zoom fatigue that we've had. And so the end of school and the start of summer, we're going to just take a couple 3-week break. And that's going to hopefully give you an opportunity also just to connect to some of your community members, some of your friends and colleagues, and maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that we've looked at and we've seen and learned about so far. Then when we come back in the middle of June, maybe we'll be able to do in-person meetings. We don't know. We're going to be hopeful that fairly soon we can do that. But we'll start in on an every other week schedule. So based on the survey results from last week, it sounded like everybody was good with an every other week schedule, going a little bit longer with our meetings, although we're probably close to matching what they're going to be now tonight. But every other week schedule. And then we're hoping we can do building tours maybe in person towards the end of June or the first part of July. And if we see that coming up in July, we'll jump ahead and we'll talk about modern learning environments first, and then we'll go to those building tours. If it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do that, we do have some contingency plans on how to try to do some virtual building tours at least as well. So that's kind of a look at the schedule here for the next month or so. And so again, you'll get all that information emailed though to Lynette's point over just the next couple of days here. Any questions with any of that stuff relative to schedule or trying to get the additional documentation?
I think we're okay.
Okay. Well, then officially, I think we are done for this evening. Our next meeting is next week. We'll go again probably about an hour and 15 minutes. No new information, but a lot of working together next week. Watch for that email from me. And if you have any questions in the meantime, please feel free to drop Brian or I an email or a phone call. And we appreciate everybody's time tonight. Hopefully this has been somewhat insightful.